Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to BCB Main Stage 2019. In the world of spirits today, while vibrant, we tend to rely on innovations within existing categories. Our next speaker is the driving force behind one of the most exciting spirit producers who's tearing up the idea and producing indefinably beautiful spirits that defy categorization and are proudly stocked by some of the most avant-garde cocktail bars around the world. Bringing his insights and expertise, gained both during his time at Noma and at Empirical, please welcome to the stage Lars Williams.
Sorry, I'm having a little remote issue. But my name is Lars Williams. About 2.5 years ago, I started a boozery called Empirical Spirits in Copenhagen. I come to the spirits business from a slightly different angle than most, I'd say. I spent most of my life working in kitchens, and in a lot of ways, that's really shaped how I approach spirits and how we think about the flavor that are in spirits, and also fermentation, which, while I was in the kitchen, became a really critical, cool tool for reshaping the culinary landscape. Next slide. My remote's not working. Fermentation is often thought as a black box, and what I'm going to attempt to do today in a short period is quickly sort of lift up the corner of that box so we can peer in. In a strict biochemical sense, fermentation is a metabolic process where microbes convert sugars and other substances in the absence of oxygen. In a colloquial sense, fermentation is a transformation of food by microbes and enzymes produced by the microbes. I'm assuming that a lot of people in the room have played around with fermentation of one sort or the other, in your bars, wardrobes, bathrooms, whatever. But there's 6 critical things when working with fermentation. That's salinity, salt, pH, oxygen, the substrate, that is sugars or the food that the microbe is going to be eating, humidity, that's how much water is in the solution, and temperature. Next slide. But why do we even care about fermentation? Why am I up here? This is the culinary representation of a world without fermentation. It's stale, it's boring, it's simplistic. We don't really consider that the herbs you'd use in a cocktail garnish or the spices are the results of an incredibly complex biomachinery. There's more to the story than just picking a leaf and crushing it or muddling it. Fermentation is basically the opportunity to open the hood of this very complex machine, grab the controls, and have 1 billion years of evolution do the heavy lifting for you in creating flavor. Next. This is Ariel Johnson, a food scientist that worked with me in Noma for several years. And what she's holding up are a series of different compounds, which are actually found in ants, and these are compounds that ants use for communication. Is that when Ariel first started working, and I was actually doing some research on ants and the flavors that they have, and she was just sort of peering behind me and said, "Oh, why are you looking at lemongrass?" And I was like, "No, that's a communication molecule that ants will use." And she knows exactly what the molecules look like. And she goes, "Oh, no, that's lemongrass." And we dug into it and found that there's all these really amazing flavors that ants were creating for communications, but were actually the exact same compounds that we find in different foods or beverages. And I guess what I'm trying to illustrate here is the complexity of flavor. If you take something that seems very obvious or common, like there's a flavor of a strawberry, it's actually a kaleidoscope of 238 different organic compounds that make up a strawberry. and that fermentation, in sort of the active phrasing which we're using it here, is a collaboration of a multitude of microbes to create flavor compounds that would be otherwise impossible to formulate, no matter how much kit or technology you have at your hands. And that's the most important thing that I'm going to sort of touch on tonight, is the relationship that you have to build with the microbes. Because fermentation really is a collaboration, a relationship, and that process is more akin to cultivation or raising livestock or something like that. This is on the door of the fermentation chamber of the world's best katsuobushi maker. Katsuobushi is a Japanese technique for taking bonito, and then it's boiled, smoked, and then double fermented over the course of 6 months. And you get this really beautiful, slightly smoky umami shavings. And this is his playlist for the katsuobushi. So he's decided that Mozart gives him the best results. And that really shows that, I mean, he's a weirdo, but how much he really cares about the process that's going on and his dedication to it, and the real sense of a relationship that he has with what he's doing. Next slide. So here's some common compounds that are created by fermentation. So Aspergillus oryzae, which we use quite a lot in our distillery. That's the beginning of sake process. So you take grains, soak them, steam them, and then inoculate it with the mold Aspergillus oryzae. And you get although it's breaking down the starches into simple sugar changes, it's also creating the perception of sweetness. So in our spirit, that really adds complexity and levels of flavor. Acetic acid, glutamic acid. Next slide. Yeah. But then you can also, most of, if you're common with wine or beer brewing, diacetyl is often one that's thought as like the big no-no. But if you're shaping the flavor, and if you want to work with that, it allows you to really kind of create some really interesting flavors. Benzyl hydride, that's one that's found in plumstone, so it gives you really interesting marzipan flavor. But these are all kind of examples of flavor compounds that can be created in the fermentation process. Next slide. You can just go. Again, here. So we have, and these are a lot of kind of terms that you use in sort of wine, but so creamy, buttery, cheesy, old cooking oil, paint. Next slide. You can just keep on going. So we do a lot of trial and error at our distillery. This is just kind of an example of what beta testing different fermentations look like. So one of the things that is always that I guess this one is an illustration about failure. So if we have 50 boxes here, we're likely to only have 1 or 2 that actually be successful. But we try and have a very short feedback loop, so we iterate very quickly, and definitely have the mindset that nothing is impossible or even too weird to try. Next slide. So this is the process for making Koji. So we use pearled barley for our Koji. It's soaked overnight, steamed. You sort of make sure it's loose and gently so you break up the barley as it's kind of cooling down. we sprinkle with Koji spores, which is Aspergillus oryzae, and then we hold it at very specific temperatures. What's interesting about Koji is that you can really shape the flavor and its primary metabolic path depending on what temperatures and humidity that you're allowing the Koji to be in. So around 28 degrees Celsius, it's producing a lot of protease, and so you'd use that for making miso. Around 37 degrees Celsius, it's producing far more amylase, and so that's the kind of Koji that you would grow for sake making. So it depends on what type of end process you're trying to do. This is Rekka, who we call our Koji queen, and this is our Koji fermentation room at the distillery. And you can see this is after about 24 hours. The Koji mycelium is already sort of clumping up the grains together. And so we constantly are sort of tossing the Koji to ensure that it ferments properly. This is a time lapse of Koji growing. This is actually on rice grains, but so you can see the mycelium becomes very active, and this kind of yellowish is going into the sporulation. So once it sporulates, it basically produces like a kind of dust, and then you can use that for the next batch of Koji. So in a miso process, you take Koji, and in this case, this is one that we did at Noma, so we used yellow peas instead of soybeans. Mix Koji, yellow peas, salt, and then basically thyme. At our distillery, we try and utilize every element of our waste stream. So all the grains that we use for brewing, we are either making shoyus or misos. Just because, in my opinion, if you can't figure out what to do with something that still has a lot of value, it's just sort of like a lack of creativity or innovation. So basically, we're taking something that instead of going into the bin or going to a big farm or something like that, we're creating like another product of value. And so we sell both misos and shoyus at our tasting room. This is a process for garum. This is one with squid guts. So it's squid guts, salt, Koji, water, and then just aged. We held it at 60 degrees to sort of speed up the Maillard process because the protease that the Koji creates is activated most intensely at around 60 degrees. Again, this is just a way to sort of illustrate the potential of using something like Koji and the different processes it can give you. Also for so this is actually a Koji that, or a quote-unquote Koji, that we grew on manioc. So in this case, most manioc or cassava is actually poisonous, and typically it would have to be cooked at a very high temperature, boiled for quite a long time to break down the toxins. The Koji fermentation does the same thing, but without heat. So this is a way for us to do two things. One, break down the starches into simple sugars so that we can ferment them. And two, not kill people. And so this is the beginning of a spirit that we're going to be releasing later this year. That was a collaboration with Alex Atala and his restaurant Dom. So it's a spirit that's 100% manioc. That's fermented with sake yeast. This guy, some of you may recognize, this is a Kombucha SCOBY. So the kombucha fermentation is a parallel fermentation of both yeast and acetic acid. So it's a it's a symbiotic relationship between the two. So basically, you can take anything that's sort of sweet and basically turn it into something that's fermented and slightly effervescent. It's a really surprisingly resilient fermentation. It can easily be cajoled, bullied, processing a really wide range of flavors. Most people think of it as like a tea, but you can actually make kombuchas based on fruit juices, carrot juice. If you're kind of careful, you can actually get it to digest lactose, so different milks. So you can actually make these really beautiful creme fraiches or even cheeses with kombucha. So the kombucha is a way to also fast track the sort of complex flavors that are created in like a fermentation, sort of as a normal yeasting fermentation, like wine. So you can get, in a very short period of, say, 5 to 7 days, something that's as complex as wine without having to go through that type of fermentation. In our spirits, we use quite a bit of kombucha, and we will blend an alcoholic distillation with a distilled kombucha. That gives us a kind of more complex and round characteristic to our spirits. So, so instead of diluting our spirits with water to sort of change ABV, we'll typically use like a distilled kombucha to do the same thing. And because acetic acid binds to organic compounds in a slightly different way than alcohol, it gives us a more complete sense of the flavor. So we're attacking it from 2 different directions. Here's the process. So in this case, blackcurrant leaves, made a tea, typically around 12% sugar, 10 to 12. There's a popular misconception that the kombucha SCOBY is actually what starts the fermentation. It's a zoological mat of mostly cellulose. So it's actually a result of the fermentation and something that the organism does to protect itself from contamination. Again, the temperature that you're holding this fermentation at makes a big difference in terms of whether the yeast is more active or whether acidic bacteria is more active. And it's just one of these things that it really becomes like a pet in a lot of ways. So everyone's very everyone takes a lot of care of their SCOBYs. Yeast is usually considered for its rightfully brilliant ability to create alcohol, but it can also show an incredible complexity in its metabolic pathways. For instance, beer is essentially just sweet barley water, and the difference that you get in flavor is from the yeast, not less so than the actual grain bill itself. And that's it's the yeast, and then also the environment that you're allowing the yeast to be active in. So again, temperature, acidity, how sweet your barley water is. High level of sugars will make them create different compounds. They create different compounds at low temperatures than they do high. The growth cycle produces wildly different secondary metabolic flavors than what they're actually doing to create alcohol. So in our fermentation, we actually slow down the yeast by pumping it with a lot of oxygen for the first 2 days. So we don't actually allow it to create any alcohol for the first 2 days. We just encourage it to be in a growth cycle, because that's where you get the most flavor creation. And that's probably one of the oldest fermentations that humans have done. So this is a diagram of metabolic pathways of yeast, and I just pull it up to illustrate the kind of complexity of different things that you can sort of encourage and shape the yeast into. This is a matamba. It's a fruit from Zimbabwe. And we're doing a collaboration with a group of women in Zimbabwe, and we're setting up actually helping them set up a lab where they can isolate local wild yeasts and then use that to create a sense of terroir. Because that's the other thing about fermentation, is being able to take a local indigenous yeast and use that to create a very specific flavor profile that's part of that terroir. And it's not just about the grapes or the fruit that creates that sense of a landscape. You can just skip. This is maphora. It's a fruit that's used in a really gross alcohol called marula. And this is what we are creating a local wine. So I was down in Zimbabwe for a week and worked with the women, and we basically made a wine out of this with a wild fermentation. Again, that allows us to really have like a fermented beverage which has a very specific kind of terroir. This is lactic fermentation. In this case, seps here. Salt. In this case, we want to reduce the amount of, or eliminate oxygen in the system, because otherwise we'll be getting, by reducing the amount of, or eliminating oxygen and adding salt, basically lactic bacteria is one of the few microbes that can survive in that kind of environment. So it sort of isolates it and prevents contamination. We don't use very much lactic fermentation in distillery because lactic acid is actually too heavy to evaporate or distill. But we do use, at Noma, we used a lot of lactic fermentation for doing different juices. So this is a very simple kind of fermentation that is very easy to do and good for sort of getting your fermentation going. Next slide. So here we have, this is a kombucha that with, and a rather large rotovap that we use for some of the acetic fermentations that we do. Which kombucha is this, Chris? Habanero. So this is a second half of one spirit that we did, where we did a habanero alcoholic distillation and then a habanero kombucha, and then we blend the two afterwards. Next slide. Vinegar. Substrate that you want to work with, as white asparagus in this case, apple vinegar, which is, you just need a organic compound that has the acetic bacteria alive in it, a certain amount of alcohol, aerate it. In this case, we want to have as much oxygen as possible because that is where the acetic bacteria really thrives. this is when we talk about flavor in the distillation, so in our distillery, I always think about it as sort of a narrative arc. And that's sort of an analogy between the narrative arc of flavor and the metabolic arc of fermentation. We sort of think of it as like sort of curved sort of journey in the same way that you have are telling a story with little peaks or sort of challenges in the flavor. Next slide. We at this point consider ourselves more of a flavor company than only being a distillery, but we, for the most part, produce alcoholic beverages of one kind or the other. And this is a alcohol molecule, and I just use it to illustrate why alcohol is such an ideal compound for capturing flavor. Hydrogen bonds are what organic molecules stick to each other with, and you can see each one of these H's is basically a point where organic compounds, flavors, can actually bind to the alcohol. So for us, it's a way of taking flavor and being able to sort of compress that flavor and preserve it. Next slide. And this is illustration of something that we do a little bit differently in our distillery. Normally, when in a distillation process, you separate the alcohol coming out of the still into 4 or 5 cuts. That's segmenting it as it comes out of the still. The very first one is 4 shots, which are the light poisonous alcohols like methanol. Then you have the heads, which is usually quite high in flavor, but can be rough. So mezcaleros will sometimes go quite deep into the heads because they like the flavor creation, but that's also why it can be like a bit punchy. Then you have the hearts, which is the bulk of the spirit that you're keeping, and then the tails, which is the aqueous leftover water that's low in ABV. We separate the hearts section of the run into between 50 and 80 cuts. That allows us to make sure that we don't have any parts of our distillation that are too rough. We can just put those to the side. But when we're working with botanicals, it allows us to really shape the flavor, almost like we're being able to play with the flavor like in Photoshop or something. To go back to the strawberry, if you take that strawberry, thinking of that flavor as a ball, and sort of stretch that flavor into like a really long line, we get cuts that taste like banana, cuts that taste like melon, cuts that taste a little bit peppery. So we can actually then, reblending those 80 cuts, actually shape the flavor into whatever it is that we think is the ideal strawberry flavor. These are the men and women. We're actually 10 more people in our distillery now. Next slide. And then I think you can click one more time. But why are we talking about flavor? We ought to automatically execute most of our everyday monotonous acts, like opening a door or buttoning a shirt, without any explicit realization of the learned movements, and there's some memory involved, unless something's amiss or wrong. The door sticks, the button's missing. With flavor, the same is true. People generally just consume without much of awareness of how ingrained their likes and dislikes are, unless there's a nudge, a shudder in there every day. So the best way to trigger a direct emotional response is to juxtapose the implicitly familiar with the novel. That is to say, orchestrating flavors to some novel combination, but somehow evoking a delighted childhood memory. Often these seem to be universal: walking through the forest, having the surf wash up between your toes, the goofy grin of an infant eating ice cream for the first time. And then if one can generate fluctuations in the flavor so that it has length, depth, and breadth punctuated by peaks along the narrative arc, then it's successful. An exploration that can continue to stimulate the contrast between novelty and memory. Flavor has a special capacity to trigger memories, especially emotionally charged memories, because of the direct connections olfaction has with parts of the limbic system in generating emotion and memory. Olfaction is unique in being the only sensory system that projects directly to the amygdala without being gated by the thalamus, and thus creates flavor memories that are not continually reconstituted by the normal recollection process. None of our other senses have this level of targeted connection with the areas of the brain that process emotion, associated learning, memory. So why is flavor important? It's a fundamental way that people connect, share memories, and interact. Sharing flavor is a way to exchange cultures and have an insight into another place and people. And these days, that's something this world could use more of. Thank you. Any questions? Cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. I just want to remind you that Lars has a tasting session at the Taste Forum Stage B later at 4:30. So please feel free to visit him. And if you want to say hi, have more questions, enjoy the rest of the show.